was talking about earlier, I primarily at the moment make feature fiction films, and actually I haven't published on Screenworks since, when was it, 2006, 2007, and part of the issue there is around the fact that these films are commercially available and therefore essentially sit behind paywalls, and there are external investors often involved, and it makes that whole process more complicated, but something to really explore, I think. But thank you all for joining in this session. As Roy was saying, this is going to be an interactive session, so although I'm going to start off with some comments really just to spark the conversation around some set or sort of semi-structured questions I've put in place. I'm hoping this is going to be driven by you all, and I'm just essentially going to facilitate it and maybe provoke an odd question here and there. I was going to be joined, as Roy was saying, by Matt Freeman, and we were going to do a double act because, you know, his experience is more in the sort of multimedia area and engagement with business and enterprise. And I think, you know, it was going to be very useful to have a look at impact issues across the spectrum, where my work is more leaning towards the ethnographic, also economic impacts, but via the ethnographic, if I can put it like that. So we'll maybe talk about that later. So you've just got me, I'm afraid. So hopefully we'll still be able to cover a lot of ground. I want to thank Charlotte and her team for a wonderful session this morning, raising all sorts of really interesting issues around research. And for those of you who are not UK based, you know, we are in the middle of what we call a research excellence framework process at the moment, where all the quality of our research gets assessed by panels set up by Research England. And this is important in the sense that the impact agenda that has been set by Research England has increased. In other words, they've increased the importance of impact in that assessment. And they have already signaled that in the next research excellence framework, which is going to happen in 5, 6, 7 years' time, whenever that happens, impact is going to feature even more prominently in their assessment of research. So I think it's you know, very useful in a conference like this to be able to touch on this and look at what that means for us as creative practitioners operating, I think, in a world where this is a bigger and bigger issue. And from my point of view, and I'll in a sense just go through the kind of history of what I've been through, just mention a couple of issues that I'm having to deal with as a faculty director of research, and to show that other side of that kind of strategy side of things, and then to see, you know, what that means in terms of the work that we are all doing on the ground. I think, you know, Charlotte mentioned a very, very important word in relation to this, which is significance. You know, and the title of this session, of course, is, you know, what difference do we make? And, you know, when I use the word impact, please bear in mind that that's I'm just using the word that REF are using, that the UK research councils are using. But if you, for example, go to the Leverhulme Trust, impact is a dirty word. So I think we have to put, you know, we have to understand that what we're actually talking about is what difference do we make to the world around us? What, you know, what changes happen as a consequence of what we do? And what we call that can be an issue we can discuss. I was struck by very fond memories when Charlotte was talking about the launch of Screenwork back in the day when we all had a session in Salford. I think I don't know if Des was around in those days. I know Jill was, and you know, we had loads of debates around practice and how to get practice recognized within the academies and at government level as well. And of course, that debate about the merging of AMPE, Association of Media Practice Educators, into MEXA, was a really hot debate, because the research agenda at the time was really being driven in our area by people who were coming out of cultural studies. And we had a whole constituency of practitioners who'd come out of industry predominantly. And these two cultures were coming together, and we were trying to define the role of practice, creative practice in that kind of context. I think where we are now, as Charlotte, I think, is indicating, that at government level, at Research England level, and so on, the battle has been won, largely. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the feedback from Ref 2014, and sorry to our international participants, but it's just a reference point for us to just start the discussion. They said that, if you look at panel D, which is where we all belong, they said that some of the best research that they saw coming into those panels was practice-led research. And some of the best of that was very personal in nature, from which one could extrapolate wider significances. And it's this issue of wider significances that I think that our debate is really about. How do we take those very personal interests, those very personal agendas we have around our creative practice, and how do we make them significant for the rest of the world, and engage with some of the other agendas that are going on? And no doubt we can come back to that. A big issue has been, I think, as Charlotte was pointing out, is the fact that actually most of the battles we're having are at local level, within our institutions. And, this is where I've personally had some very interesting scrapes, because as a faculty director, my new constituency of people is, my boss is a professor of medicine. I'm working with, with colleagues in engineering who are bringing in 10 times as much research money as we are in the arts and humanities. In the health faculties, where they have huge, when I'm talking about research funding, we're talking billions of pounds going into research into the health areas. I go to a meeting and we've got access to some infrastructure funding, and piddly little me from the arts and humanities trying to scrape some infrastructure funding in amongst a group of people, for example, who are saying, oh, the Home Office visited us the other day and our live animal testing facility failed its inspection and we need to invest in those areas immediately. This is the kind of area in which we are certainly in terms when it comes to accessing resources that we're up against. So part of the challenge, I think, is about how do we start talking about what we're doing as being important. I will say this flippantly in this forum, that and this is just a flippant remark, just to really emphasize that point, that in my view, what we have to achieve is the fact that, if we, I can imagine a world without doctors, but I cannot imagine a world without culture. That's how important we need to think about what we're doing is. A great example of that is I heard a story from Baroness Amos when she went to northern Kenya once to visit a refugee camp. She said she met this woman who had walked from South Sudan for weeks, probably months, and ended up in this refugee camp. And she set off with 4 children and arrived with none. Now, the engineers can build the camp, the infrastructure people can bring water to the camp, the medical people can give her medicine and patch her up, and then what? And this is an example, I think, of where we in the arts and humanities can play a really significant role in impacting the world around us. And this is just one example where I'm talking about international intervention, because of course these things can be very much more local as well, and we have plenty of examples of that. But anyway, so we've been through debates around the role of practice in institutions. One of the big issues that I had to deal with when coming into as a faculty director in my area was how do I, and I was chair of our panel D submission to this recent ref. So I saw all of our impact case studies and so on. one of the challenges we had was how do we articulate the value of our research in the context of this transdisciplinary setting. And I think this is perhaps something we can come back to. How do we talk about research in a way that others from outside our disciplines can understand what we're talking about? We are working in transdisciplinary contexts in which other disciplines are using media practice as part of their research strategies. So we are not the only people doing creative practice. And it's very interesting. You only have to look at the digital humanities, or if you go into medicine, there are loads of methodologies that they're employing where they're looking at creative practice as part of their methods of engaging with health issues. And it's something to bear in mind, I think, when we're thinking about the broader context of what's going on. That obviously leads to lots of collaborative working, lots of collaborative opportunities, not just as a kind of service industry for other areas, but I think also in terms of how the research going on in other sectors might impact how we think about the work that we're doing. And maybe this is something we can touch on as well. A big issue for us, I think, which we'll come to when we're looking at our questions, is really who is actually driving the research agenda and what is our role in that? And I think, you know, when it comes to money, often money does the talking. And there has been some interesting research in the sciences that would suggest that actually, I've heard some suggestions that 85% of science research spending is a total waste of money. The reason being that science, which is based on replicability, when they go back and look at some of these big science studies, there was an example where they took 5 of the biggest cancer studies in the world that were published in all the top journals, received literally billions of pounds of investment. When they looked at that and tried to replicate the results using the data, they didn't get the same results. In 3 of them, they got partial results. In 2 of them, they didn't get the same results at all. And what they're saying is happening is because of the funding models and the agenda-driven models of funding, the researchers are actually skewing the interpretation of that data to address those strategic aims. And they're skewing the data in order to get published. And often that means they are effectively regurgitating the zeitgeist of the time. And this is an issue I think we have to think about in the arts as well, in terms of when we are going for research funding, when we are looking at some of these agendas that are going on, what is the actual impact on the truths or whatever it is we're trying to articulate. This has clearly had an impact on my work. You know, I've done some work, as I was saying, my Story Lab project, where we've had AHRC funding to do work in Malaysia and Colombia and Ghana, and we've done some work in California and Greece. And one of the questions I'm starting to ask myself, and which is a kind of question I want to leave you with as we go in and look at some of the questions I want to discuss, is around this whole issue of what I call reversing the gaze. I mean, it is a term that's becoming more established in anthropology, but that idea that we always tend to be going out to be working with the other, whether this is in the developing world or whether this is communities that are closer to home, and to what extent do our interventions potentially cause more damage than good. And I say this, for example, in the context of the fact that the aid budget, the government's aid budget, is a major part of what is funding the GCRF fund into research. So essentially it's part of that aid agenda. And it would be worth looking at, you know, to what extent, you know, there's damage done actually, and not just good. So when we talk about impacts, what impacts are we actually talking about, and who are we who are we actually talking about? And I feel there's perhaps, one could potentially argue that some interventions are neo-colonial. Some research interventions are actually neo-colonial by definition. And it would just be interesting to, to explore some of those issues. So when I increasingly think about what am I doing as a researcher, what am I doing, what am I seeking to do, I ask myself three simple questions. First of all, why? Why am I doing this? And secondly, why me? And thirdly, why now? And I think it's these questions that I'd like to sort of have kind of inform some of our discussion as we move forward in the session. And what we're looking at, I've got four questions that I want to throw out for debate and discussion. And basically, the first one is, how do we, or could we, in media practice communities, define impacts? In other words, us being part of the process of defining impact and not having that imposed on us from other disciplines or from various government agendas. What role can we play in helping to define what that means? And who are our beneficiaries? A very, very important point. Audiences and partners, and how do we wish to impact them? So that's something that I'd like to have a little discussion about. The other thing I'd like to look at perhaps in our discussion is how and could we in the media practice community engage with policy-led transdisciplinary challenges beyond our own specific forms to encourage impact-led research. And this goes back to my point about the funding, that there are these grand challenges now. This seems to be the way that governments and research councils, which are effectively extensions of government, are driving the research agenda, is by setting these global challenges, whether it be the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, whether it be the government's industrial strategy or health strategies, whether it be regional strategies or local strategies. The pots of money that might fund some of our work are actually attached to these strategies. So how does that, how might we engage with some of those policy-led challenges? Thirdly, we might look at how or could our specific creative challenges and personal creative explorations relate to broader impacts. And that relates to my earlier point really about what the last ref fed back about the importance of personal research and the fact that the best of the research, the practice-led research they saw was actually quite personal in nature, but the critical thing was that one could extrapolate wider significance. So maybe we can have a discussion about the role of that kind of research. And then finally, how can we adapt or develop an appropriate language with which to discuss with our transdisciplinary colleagues the relevance of our research impacts to real-world issues, problems, and challenges. And I mean this in a political sense. One of my jobs as faculty director is to sit in there with my other faculty colleagues and the pro-vice chancellor and the vice chancellor and make the case for the fact that the investment in the research that is going on in the arts and humanities is critical to the health of the nation or the health of communities, and that it needs to be afforded similar investment and value as we see in some other areas. If you were, I don't know how familiar you are with the comparative investment in the sciences compared to the arts and humanities, you would be shocked. I mean, we get peanuts when it comes to investment, yet I think we as a community need to start to articulate. So that last question is really about how do we develop a language? How do we impress on our colleagues the relevance of our research to the broader challenges around us? So those are just some brief thoughts to get the conversation going. So I'm going to just go back and you know, and there might be a moment's silence while you think about this, but to ask that first question, you know, and this is, by the way, you know, I can see that some of these questions, you know, they're going to merge into each other, and you know, we might spend more time on one and less on another. That doesn't matter, but I will try and see if, you know, we make sure we get through them all if possible. Let's see how it goes. So really what I want to, you know, really start with is to, if we can have a discussion really around what we mean by impact, and what you know, what do you mean by impact, bearing in mind that we might not always use that word, but in terms of what difference, you know, when you talk about difference that your research is making, what does that mean to you? And who are the beneficiaries of that? So is there anybody who wants to kick off with some thoughts or reflections? Silence. It's a tough one, you know. I come into this because, you know, I want to try and change the world one story at a time. I assume that we all want to make a better world in one way or another. So what are the kind of ways in which your particular research or your particular interests are making these little incremental contributions to making a world a better place? And who are the beneficiaries of that? Who are you trying to reach? I see we have Matthew.
Yeah, thank you for Erik for that. Yeah, it's a very provocative kind of opening and really an important one. And I guess so much of my work would be seen as, I guess, low impact in terms of an institutional framework. So I might create a piece of work that engages perhaps with a montage technique, which would be perhaps interesting to 3 or 4 people in an artist's moving image filmmaking, perhaps, but that's some impact, right?
Oh yes, and don't belittle that.
Well, I think that's what we need to be able to do, right? Had to be able to, I guess.
You started off by saying low impact.
Yeah, but I'm sure my vice chancellor would think it's very low impact. I think my vice chancellor, I think, would rather I didn't exist entirely, actually, but that's a different story. But also, I engage with some kind of ethnographic documentary practices in communities. So I made a observational documentary where I was working with one household for sort of 5 years. And the sort of star of that documentary is sort of best friends with myself and my wife, who we make films together. She actually was my wife's maid of honor at our wedding.
And so Matthew, how would you define the kind of changes that you're trying to make?
Yeah, well, I guess certainly a lot of the work I do in the documentary mode is engaging with sort of small communities, and it's never an even relationship, right? I'm sure you know better than I. But we make small changes in the lives of the people that we meet, right? By engaging with them, by listening to them, by becoming, everybody I work with becomes a friend, I think. That's just the sort of way that I work. My last film, you know, that we finished maybe 6 months ago, the participant lives in Poland, but she will be coming to stay with us for a few months, and they have a profound effect on my life as well. They change me, but I don't know is it possible to quantify that in an institutional setting, and how do we value that? I know everybody here probably values those relationships, as we're all kind of artists, and I think maybe we're more empathetic creatures by nature, perhaps. I don't know, but that's something that I value, and I don't know how to frame that, I guess.
When you start off on a piece of work like that, do you set off with something in the back of your mind about something that you would like to change, either in the form or the process or the people that you're trying to engage?
I guess the way I work, it normally starts with a kind of mix of form and content, right? And that relationship between the two. So is there a way of creating a piece of work that engages with a particular community or a particular topic that perhaps is new to me, at least?
So you have a particular community in mind when you're creating your work. Do you?
Yeah, quite often. I mean, my wife also works in the area of. I mean, she works in many areas actually, but we have a sort of shared interest in sort of belonging and migration and community. So that can be a starting point. So we might start with people we know that we're interested in and engaging with, or a particular story that maybe is not heard at a particular time. We might want to try and, I guess, change a certain discourse, perhaps. And at the same time, so my wife sort of starts with the people. She feeds back into me. I might start with technique, and then and we sort of exchange ideas there, and then it sort of unfolds. And then hopefully with more kind of reading and research, it sort of folds back into the work again. Yeah, I guess that's my final point.
That's very interesting, Matthew, because maybe a little later on we can talk about how one captures and evidences that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's, and you know, if we can maybe try and reiterate that that's valuable too, right?
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew. Neil.
Hello there. Ooh, start my video. Hello. Hiya.
Hello.
Yeah, I think for me, it's yeah, it's kind of it's thinking about the impact in the project from a kind of a creative sort of starting point, you know. So the films that we make at Falmouth, you know, we're always thinking about how we can impact filmmakers, you know, independent filmmakers, particularly in Cornwall, but certainly kind of on a national level, but using Cornwall as a kind of as a space for it, but kind of acknowledging that there is a need for support and community and collaboration for independent film in the UK, and trying to find what interventions universities can make in that space that supports an ecosystem and supports those filmmakers, not just in terms of getting work made, but in having sustainable working patterns, be that as filmmakers or kind of in the whole ecology of it. So within film education, within sort of, you know, mentoring and support within the region. And that's always been the driving force for the work that we've done, which is, you know, let's support filmmakers, and let's hope that the impact is on filmmakers and filmmaking, which by extension is audiences, and thinking about the audience as a kind of significant sort of beneficiary. When I sort of went to write that up, it was really hard to think about the audiences in terms of the impact, because although we had a huge number of audiences, particularly around the film Bait, it was really hard to do the quantification that was asked. You know, how do you track 15 films and their festival runs and their cinema screenings? And, you know, like it was a huge ask. In the end, we just had to kind of put it to the side, because it was me on half a day a week trying to do that. And it was just, you know, so that's something we learned in terms of trying to track that better. But still, I think it's going to be, you know, that even within, you know, even within what was hopefully a solid impact case study, there was still a big problem in terms of, you know, how you actually do that kind of measurement. If you're having the impact that people want, it's really hard to quantify it other than saying loads of people saw this work. Which,
yeah, this is a very important point, Neil, and we'll come back to this issue of articulating and defining it. As you know, I oversaw 15 impact case studies, and this was the single biggest issue, yeah, in all of them. Because, you know, it's you know, somebody in the medical science can say, well, I saved lives. I saved so many lives, you know? Okay. But it's interesting you're saying that your beneficiaries that you're thinking about are the local independent filmmakers, in a sense, as part of a pathway to having further impacts in the community.
Yeah, and what we were able to do is kind of really show the links in terms of how either national producers benefited from interventions and how those interventions then impacted graduates staying in the region who are kind of not students, you know, emerging professionals, and how they might how their career might be accelerated, and how that connects with national producers and kind of national producers talking about the benefits of working in the region with a kind of a talent pool they might not have considered before. So, you know, that was really interesting, was how through that we could create a conversation mainly from testimonials about the impact, and having those industry professionals really be able to articulate what the impact was for them was really strong. And I think the fact that you can build so much of it around testimonials is really, really important, because
absolutely.
Yeah.
And presumably also some economic on the local media economy that you might be able to capture as well as impact.
Yeah, absolutely. That was quite easy to track in terms of like, that the employment, but also returns and receipts within the region for some of those companies that were involved. And what was nice was that part of the process made us realize in a really specific way what the impact was that we kind of felt instinctively. You know, what drove those projects was let's make films and let's help people and let's make good work and try and make work that sits in a kind of commercial professional sector rather than, you know, student work or, you know, kind of just I don't want to use local as disparaging because I don't believe in that, but I think that distinction between making work that people in Cornwall might see, but and then trying to make work that is Cornish driven and based, but other people see, and then being able to articulate that through the case study was really valuable in terms of
That sounds like a great example where you have a very clear sense of your beneficiaries and you have a very clear sense of what the impacts, and you've benefited from having gone through this process, I presume, of having to write an impact case study.
Yeah, it was horrible work. But yeah, the benefits to us in terms of understanding how we can now articulate what we do as research moving forward was really, really valuable.
Yeah, that's really great example, Neil. Thanks very much. Ivan.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to share a few points about that because I think this question of being impactful has been part of my process for a long time and has helped me to grow and to make mistakes and then to somehow correct them in a way. At least I hope I did to some degree. When I started, I was doing research in fundamental sciences, and it had nothing to do with art making, even though I was doing art on the side, but that was on the side. And I was extremely successful in terms of being evaluated by my institutions because I was producing papers, I was producing good results and everything, except that after a while, I was questioning more and more what was the point of doing that. And I reached a point of crisis where I just took a sabbatical leave and went to study acting and directing in New York, and then came back, and then took me a little while to figure out that whether I was going back to the academia or not. And I decided to go back to academia, but this time doing research practice, creation research. I prefer to call it like that, but whatever that means, it means a lot of different things. And it's also about the time where I started to make films, short films so far. I haven't made a feature film yet, working on one at the moment. And I realized, thinking about impact, that every time I've made a project, it started with a kind of anger at something, like not anger like very openly expressed, but something that I was feeling uncomfortable with. I can give a couple of examples. For instance, my first short film, sorry, already dreaming about it. My first short film was about a guy who organized a party for his birthday, and nobody comes to the party. And that came out of this thing happening to someone I knew. And I found that so violent and so like unbearable that I needed to put it inside a story. And then the second one I didn't write, but I felt very close to the material, was about a family who is doing, in France we have this tradition of the king cake. I don't know if you have it in England, where you for Epiphany you eat a cake and there is a little something in the cake, and whoever gets it is the king or the queen.
Okay.
And the tradition is that you send the younger kid under the table to decide which piece of the cake is going to be given to which person. And then there is one piece left, and the kid decides to give the piece to the homeless guy outside in the street. And then the family has to invite the guy, but obviously they don't want to. So it was really about all this social hypocrisy thing. And then the third one, I think, was more of an idea and was not as successful as the first two films in festivals, because I think it was more of an idea. It was about the intrusion of video in private lives. And I don't know, maybe the story was not well written, but yeah, to get back to your questions, and what was very interesting is that when you make short films about these topics, you make, I mean, at least I made them because I wanted to impact people on those issues and develop empathy and stuff like that. But when you make a short film, you don't really know what's going to be the life of your short film. And I was very lucky to go to a festival where both my first short films were screened. And that's I guess how you measure the impact that you can have in the fact that you have these conversations with the audience, and then you understand what they are reacting to and how they react to what you were presenting to them. And to get back to your question, why do I do it? Why me and why now? That's exactly what is guiding my feature film, because I have like so many ideas for a feature film, but then I had a lot of trouble to pick the first one.
Yeah.
I picked the first one because it's very timely.
Ivan, you actually raise a very interesting point that I want to just put out to the rest of the group around the fact that if one makes a film and you show it to an audience and you don't do anything else, would you consider, what would you consider to be your personal impact agenda, and how would you define that? We're often talking about doing, engaging with health issues and engaging with, developing world issues and so on and so forth. But the idea of making a film and showing it to an audience, how can we incorporate that process as part of an impact agenda? What are how would we define the impacts we're trying to achieve there?
Oh, it's interesting because I guess my film has been seen by people without me being even aware of it and having the opportunity to interact with them. And I think the interaction part of it is not so much about the impact, but it's for me to have an idea of the impact, which doesn't mean that when I don't communicate with the audience, there is no impact. And I think the impact, I have it in my mind as I make the film, when I think that I want to make people aware of this issue and maybe make them a bit more empathetic, like next time they are invited to a party, maybe, this kind of things. But
yeah, I mean, every filmmaker, I suppose, is trying to impact their audience in one way or another, and to move them and so on and so forth. But we in the, once we move into the academy, so to speak, presumably we're trying to create some new insights into how we can generate impacts or influence the field in which we're working, whether it be in the form or in the process, and then presumably to audiences. So in this kind of sense, we can start to talk about pathways to impact. One can talk, for example, about different ways of constructing a narrative that might introduce audiences to new ways of looking at film, for example, or looking at a certain subject, and you would point to that as a pathway to an impact. The question then is, how do you then measure, how do you then capture? Well, we can maybe come back to that. But I think this is a very important point, because there are very many creative practitioners who are not interested in going into the third world and saving poor people, or doing some kind of government-driven project around, economic strategy or whatever, who want to, for example, move people. For example, in my case, I'm interested in exploring different ways of telling stories that allow people access to their spiritual way of living lives in our society and so on. And you might say, well, how on earth are you going to capture that? How on earth are you going to capture the potential impacts of that? And here it's worth just reminding ourselves what is meant by impact. We're talking about making a difference to somebody, somewhere. And when you look at how, for example, the ref measures that, they look at who, they want to know who's been impacted, how has it changed their lives? So this is something we need to think about, even if it's our intention and how we're building that intention into what we're doing, which is what we call a pathway to impact. It's about thinking about those issues. So Ivan, that's maybe something interesting for you to think about in your work, isn't it? About how you're building those pathways, and where is it you're trying to take those beneficiaries? Where is this new place you're trying to take your audience, your beneficiaries, depending on what language you're using?
Yeah, but there is also a difference in terms of the research part of it, because
yeah.
I was like recently, we all go through evaluations of some sort at some point, but then I realized at some point that it's kind of like, who do you make film for? But it's the same, who do you do research for? And then I realized at some point that I'm not making research for the people who are evaluating me. No. I'm doing research for the society at large.
Yeah.
And that should be, I should be evaluated by, the society at large, because obviously the evaluation would probably be very different.
Yeah.
And it kind of twists the motivation of making it, kind of like you want to conform too much to
there's that personal ambition. But in a sense, what we're talking about is when somebody else starts to pay for it, they want to be able to justify to their paymasters what the benefit of this investment is. And this is what this auditing is about, yeah? And it's partly, if we want access to some of those resources, we have to learn a little bit about how we can address some of those issues for those investors. Shall I press on to the second question? Are we okay to move on to the second question? Yeah.
I think Roy has his hand.
Oh, sorry, Roy, I didn't see that.
I just want to pick up on this conversation about impact that you've been having, and give actually a kind of really concrete example that happened. I think it happened earlier this week. And I had a meeting with a group of marine biologists at Portsmouth University about a project that we're trying to run. It's an Arts Council application. It hasn't been funded yet, but we're developing it. And the idea is there'll be partnership between some of their postgraduate researchers and artists going into schools, kind of making interventions, getting conversations started, making work. And the senior professor at the meeting said, "How are you going to measure impact?" And I thought, well, okay, that's a good question. And I thought, well, from the Arts Council's point of view, really, they're a bit like, well, how many people have been involved? How many people were, the same as you were saying, if you screen a film, how many people watched it? And while they're probably happy to look at other impact factors, they're not really asking for that when they look at the evaluations at all. And the same with applications to people like BFI, they're really not asking you to evidence sort of a transformation in people. There's how many people watched it. But these kind of academics and this marine biologist saying, "Oh, well, but that's not impact. That's not impact." And so we got into a discussion about, well, what we want to do is to change people's views about the city and their perception of the city in relation to the environment and how we're polluting the sea and plastics and so on. So we want to create some kind of change. And so there is a theory of change implicit in the project, but that change may not come about for some years, and the project will end after a year, and there is no further funding at that point in time. So how do you do that? That's a big challenge, is that actually, and I think when Craig Batty did a keynote at the last Practice Network, I think it was at Lancashire actually, and he talked about this, is that impact very often happens way down the line. So the professor said, oh, but you can evaluate intention to change behavior. And I thought, well, that's great. That's brilliant. We can do that. And so now we can evaluate impact. But it's not really evaluating impact, is it? It's kind of cheating.
Well, it's what they call pathways to impact. Right? You're laying the track along which potential impacts might incur. And I suppose it's then about somebody evaluating how realistic that looks and how but you're right, it's not about how many people you reach. It is about what changes you make. So to give you an example of what my own impact case study, I can point to the fact that we did some research, around what I call ethnometeorology, where we're doing ideation workshops with a community in Colombia, Santa Marta, who were not recognized by the government because, anyway, that's a long story. And there we were working with a community who had never done any kind of media activity, any kind of, funded activity from outside of their community. And we did some workshops with them. And out of that, then you have a number of impacts that you can directly measure, because 2 of the participants there are now going on to do college level work in media, which they would never have done because they can testify to the fact that it never even entered their mind. Yeah? We can point to the fact that some of the participants because we did 2 sets of workshops, so the people delivering the workshops were also local, and they have gone on to teach in a university and have taken some of the techniques from those workshops and applied them in their context. So these are very specific things one can point to where there has been a change. Yeah? And that's what impact is about. It's about change. You can impact 5 people, but if you can evidence that you have changed them in some way or other, change one of their practices or change their outlook or whatever, then that would be considered impact.
Okay, the pathways to impact, that gives me some hope, because I kind of sat there thinking, intention to change is not really impact. Is it kind of, because I have lots of intentions to change, but I don't necessarily do any of them.
But what you're doing is you're saying we're putting this in place, we're putting this in place, we're constructing this, we are designing this, we are doing that, and this is our pathway to impact.
I like it. That's very helpful, actually.
Jamie.
Yes, hello, Erik. Thank you very much. I'm really enjoying this talk. I was just wondering that I sort of expect that it's at least partly a question of discourse, of actually knowing a particular type of language to use. And I sort of imagine that there's certain terms that we would use in kind of casually and sort of quite sort of, and would think, oh yes, people will think that's a good thing. And that everyone else would be like, oh no, that sort of alarm bells would start to ring that surround certain types of discourse. So I was sort of kind of wondering, as somebody who gets into to sit in on these meetings, where there's certain types of language that are an immediate turn off and certain types that are actually quite, oh yes, that's quite attractive, and that's sort of playing our game, if you like. One term that I think I see in the chat quite a lot is the term art, and I always think that is, you're doomed. Asking for funding for that, and that's not to disparage people who consider themselves those things, but just that it because of its connotations of a kind of slightly introspective and romantic kind of idea that is almost by definition in some people's minds anti kind of impact. And in that way, my second point would be second question really would be connected to the kind of you referenced earlier, that one of the surprises that you had was that the expectation was that people would operate in a kind of cultural studies field, but that the examples that you thought worked best came from a kind of more introspective, personal and individual kind of agenda. And I was wondering if you could give some examples of impactful studies that come from that perhaps more kind of artistic kind of background and sort of field.
Wow, I mean, that's an interesting question, JB. I mean, just to give you one quick example that pops into my head is one of my colleagues, he submitted an impact case study for this ref. He's a Woody Guthrie expert. He performs Woody Guthrie songs and he adapts them and he contextualizes them in the contemporary politics and the historicity. And what he can demonstrate is that from his touring, he is influencing the debate around not only Woody Guthrie's music, but the debate that people are having about contemporary politics, for example, around Trump. Yeah. So he can evidence the impact of him performing on debates. And this is through obviously the media representations, it is through testimony, it is through, a variety of other things. So here is a performer, a composer, an expert in a single musician having significant impact in some of the political debates that are happening around US politics. He's an American himself, and having also impact obviously on the study and understanding of Woody Guthrie and the protest song. Yeah. So, and in my view, that's a potential 4-star impact case study. So and he's extremely well respected within our university, partly because it's tangible what he's doing, and he's very effective at demonstrating, the impacts that he's having on contemporary political debates. And it brings us nicely to the fourth question, which we can jump around. How can we adapt or develop an appropriate language with which to discuss with other transdisciplinary colleagues the relevance of our research impacts to the real world issues, problems, and challenges? And this is kind of what you're talking about, Jamie, isn't it, in a sense? And one of the first things I did when I arrived at UCL, and I realized that when I sat down with the practitioners and we talked about practice-based research, was that the language about it was all over the place. You could not put my dance colleagues in front of a bunch of engineers and have them successfully explain what they were doing. So I literally wrote a glossary for practitioners and circulated that to all my practice colleagues, where we took the language that we know they talk in the sciences, and we looked at how does that translate to what we do? It's not about changing what we do, it's simply about changing the language. So you think about things like outputs, for example, the difference between outputs and publication. Yeah, this is something every engineer understands. Well, in the case of a dance, you might say, well, the dance itself is the output. In the case, well, what is it that makes it a publication? Well, if you have a show and you're showing it in front of an audience, you are publishing it. So that's just an example of how one can start to develop the traditional language of research and adapt some of the things that we already do. So things like, what is the new insight? How would you describe your new insight? And we're talking about impacts. What's the impact? So you say, again, sticking to the dancers, you've done this wonderful piece about embodiment. So what? You say to the dancer, you have to be able to go into a meeting with these engineers and scientists and medical people and health people and explain to them in a way what difference your dance routine makes. Don't you think? And in many cases, when you sit down and talk to them, it's very easy to point out what difference it makes, because, for example, in the case I'm thinking of, they are developing dance routines that are particularly beneficial for Alzheimer's patients. Well, none of our practitioners had thought to mention that. Yeah. So that's a very simple thing. You can talk about the impact of dance on specific communities' health and well-being, mental health, for example. And you know, one of our dance colleagues was doing some work with prisoners, never thought to think about it in terms of impacts on those particular prisoners. So I think part of this language thing is very, very important. So I don't know what experiences you guys have had around this. Encounters what you've had where you've struggled to articulate what your sought after impacts are, or your pathways to impact, or what difference you're trying to make, and how your creative work is playing a part in that. Have you sort of had some encounters with other transdisciplinary colleagues?
Craig has just posted a message about difference between outputs and publications. Maybe he would like to comment.
I knew I shouldn't have.
Craig, how are you doing?
Hi, Erik. How are you? Hi, everyone. Mark, Darren, Jamie. It's like the old crew. Talk about 17 years later. Oh, I just think you talk about language, Erik, and we often talk about things like outputs, outcomes, impact, esteem, and just thinking about the differences. And well, they are different. They're not the same thing.
No.
YouTube hits is not impact.
No.
What happens with that? But you might say it's esteem, possibly, or just thinking about the language. I'm all about words, which is funny because I got them wrong on the chat. Sorry about that.
I mean, Craig, are you asking a question, or you want to say something about it?
No, I'm just putting my oar in as usual, Erik.
No, but I think this issue of language, Craig, is very, very important. And it's important partly because language itself, I think, helps us sort out our own thoughts about things. And when earlier in the morning session we talked about the definition of research, and we had various examples, but Charlotte reminded us that and I'm sorry to keep referring to REF. It's just that we're right in the middle of it. But that REF's definition, I think, is beautifully simple. It's about new insights effectively shared. And you could argue that effectively shared, then the extension of that is about the significance, what impact is it going to have? And I think when it comes to actually, if we as a sector want to engage with some of the wider agendas, some of the funding sources available, some of the transdisciplinary opportunities available, we have to become articulate about what we mean by aspects of our practice. So for me, it's about understanding the difference between outputs, publications. It's about understanding, what do you mean by new insights? Where do I see it in your work? This is where the statement that Charlotte was referring to comes in. Where do I see in your work the new insights that could lead to some kind of impact? And we need to be able to talk to our colleagues in other disciplines in a language that they understand. New insights, impacts, outputs. Esteem is an interesting one, Craig, because I remember that the Arts and Humanities Research Council had as part of their guidance, said it doesn't matter how prominent a practitioner you are, that doesn't make what you do research. I remember them having a specific statement about that, because I think some people who are very prominent in the field thought they could come in and do a project, and that would constitute research. So I think it's about being able to talk about these new insights and about their potential if not actual impact, then their potential impact, and what you're doing as a researcher to put in place that potential impact. So I mentioned dance as an example. I mean, in media, of course, we might look at the actual artifact as an output, but the dissemination of that artifact as a publication. So one of my art and design colleagues, for example, designed something called Fidgy widgets, little wooden things that people with Alzheimer's could play with, and it would improve their health and well-being. But it was clearly design driven. And you could see that in the objects themselves are the output. But it's the distribution of those objects into the nursing homes and so on that effectively constitutes the publication of them. And I think that's the kind of, potential interpretation. Now I see a lot of hands, and I've sort of lost a little sense of, I think, was it Sue first? Is it Sue? Oh.
Hello, sorry. I'm finally there. I'm on my phone, so it's a bit tricky. And I'm attached to the wall.
Where are you, Sue?
I'm in my kitchen.
Yeah, but which, are you in the UK or somewhere else?
I'm in the UK, I'm in Nottingham.
Okay.
And I suppose I've been picking up on a lot of the concepts that you've been talking about, from the personal to extrapolating from that and making universal points, which it was like nectar to hear that, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do with the work I make. I'm from a community development work background from years ago, before I got involved in higher education, but it was community arts, so it was very much about enabling conversations about working with people. So although some of my artistic films, which didn't seem to fit into a broadcast model, so they became artistic films, have been collaborating with other artists, sound people and performers and so on. But more recently, I have kind of come back around to my community development practices and started making what suddenly became known as socially engaged art. I'm not sure what the difference is, but I think it's sort of more artist-led in a way, to have dialogues with the people that I'm making the work with, so it's participatory. But then, the places that I've shown the work have been hugely different, from cinemas to galleries to people's staircases, cafes, and my ambition is to have work on billboards, rolling billboards, but I don't know what I'm trying to say really.
Could I ask you, who are you trying to impact?
I'm trying to impact the debate, the social debate around the way women are treated in society, and particularly at the moment, we've had some shocking statistics come out about how many rape cases result in convictions, and how. But it's a sort of more underlying kind of creating a culture where women feel safe to have conversations, and so that's what I try and generate with the artwork.
If I were to push you, Sue, and say, well, specifically, who are your beneficiaries? Who are you trying to make? Whose life are you trying to change as a consequence of the work that you're doing?
Does it feel rude to say mine? Because in some ways, as a female, that's where it began. But then it's also, I suppose, all women's lives. So that
the thing is that it's this thing about wider significance, isn't it? Beyond yourself, in a sense.
Yeah.
And when you say all women's lives, that is a kind of a broad claim, isn't it? I mean, I'm just wondering whether
I'm
there's
not
a
saying
way-
I've achieved it, but I think that that's the aim, is to have those conversations with women or with people more generally, by working with women to create work and to create artworks that then generate further debate. So it's about the dialogue, it's about those conversations and spreading those conversations wider. But the conversations can be quite small initially, but it's taking them into many different arenas. So, and also it's that self-reflection as part of that. So it becomes a cycle. So, in having those conversations, I'm also challenging myself and as an artist, but it's constantly about the dialogue. That is where I'm coming from with it. Okay. So I don't feel I have answers necessarily, but it's a stimulus for debate.
So you could talk in terms of creating pathways through conversations, the facilitating through your work, conversations about the subject is a pathway to impacting on a particular group of people's lives.
Yes,
potentially.
Possibly. Yeah, potentially. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think, an example might be that showing a film in an artist's home, and then the home was opened up to women or to people to come into the home and look at different artists' work. I found myself sitting down on the sofa and watching my film with somebody who was getting very upset, having a conversation about that, and it became about bereavement and what the film was tapping into that person. So that was a very, very tiny sort of example, and it's not something you can kind of capture. I'm not going to get her to sign a document and say, what did you feel about this? But
well, you might have to if you want money.
Yes, that's true. I'm not very practical in that sense.
But it's very interesting, Sue, because one of my distributor keeps giving me a hard time, because when he says, Erik, what audience are you aiming your film at? And this is in a commercial sense. I keep saying, well, everybody, of course, everybody and anybody, and he won't accept that. So, if I was doing work with you around putting together an impact case study, I would get tough on you, Sue. I would say we need to know who you're specifically who you're trying to impact.
I guess policymakers.
Okay.
Yeah, because they're the ones who are going to change, the way that we run our lives and are able to feel safe.
So you would then need to put in place pathways as to how you are going to get your work in front of those policymakers and into a discussion with them. And that would be, pathways to impact if you hadn't actually done it yet. Yeah. And it's very interesting. One of my PhD students did work in Papua in New Guinea about women who'd all lost a husband or a brother or a son in the civil war there, and about their voices being heard through filmmaking. But it was specifically addressed to those films hitting policymakers who were part of a peace and reconciliation process. So there the beneficiaries were very clearly defined. Yeah? They wanted to influence the policy of the peace and reconciliation process through the making of films. Yeah? And that was their pathway to impact. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you.
Sarah?
Hi, I think Ivan was actually next.
Oh, well.
But that's okay. I've already spoken and you haven't.
Thank you, Ivan.
Thanks, that's very kind of you. Hi, I'm Zara. I work for Leeds Beckett University as an art and design ref consultant. And in the last ref cycle, I was involved in researching and writing 6 impact case studies across Unit 32 and 33. So that's my kind of context. Also, if my internet drops out, I'm actually in a house that I'm renovating. So I'm really sorry. It's like if there's weird noise in the background. So I thought maybe I'd share one of our key issues that I find time and time again working with academics in practice-led disciplines, which has been trying to get everybody's head around the differences that, in terms of language, the differences between impact very much understood within the ref's definition of impact, and esteem and engagement. I'm always like, bums on seats, not impact. and also because at the end of the day, you could get a phenomenal, I don't know, number of hits on YouTube or number of people coming to your exhibition. You've no idea what people thought. They could have thought it was absolutely terrible. So that, you know, you can't kind of, I say, you can't claim that as impact personally.
Or they could have all been asleep, Zara.
They could have all just slept through it, but then that's an impact. They might be really well rested. health impact. And actually, I found it really interesting that you, Erik, have been raising this question of who are you trying to impact? I think that's a really interesting question because it's not something that has really foregrounded our conversations about research impact, because actually a bit of a curveball, it is a bit of a risk, one of our impact case studies, that we are submitting, which is entirely around impacts, very material impacts, material changes that took place in a major institution that were entirely unintended. They were absolutely not the intentions of the researcher who went in and applied a range of methodologies that they've used throughout their practice as a visual artist. And it changed huge thinking, which then in that organisation, which then changed a lot of their policy and practice as an institution, but was absolutely unintended. So we'll see how that pans out when we get our results. But what I've been thinking about more recently, and it's not something that we've just done in this ref cycle, is that maybe we need to be thinking, when we're looking at how we can evaluate, is whether we should be looking at collaborations with other disciplines, at looking at devising our own ways of evaluating that kind of bridge. I've already noted down what was I've lost it, there we go. It was about some sort of social value system. I've lost my notes on it. But I started thinking about the happiness index as well. But maybe we should be collaborating with maybe academics in sociology or anthropology to come up with some sort of our own evaluative system. And I was really interested to know, this is really a question for everybody, to know whether anybody has had any success doing that. So collaborating with researchers from other disciplines to come up with ways of evaluating impacts resulting from practice-led research. And also, just an aside, if I was Sue, I would maybe put together a screening specifically targeting, I don't know, a police department, a local police department, invite them so that they maybe think about how they deal with rape reporting. Something like that's what I would do.
Great idea, because there you're talking about a specific constituency. Zara, that was very, very useful, because what you're talking about is that accidental impact is actually impacts on policy, isn't it? And management. But there are a group of people involved in that whose practices have been changed. And that can be pointed to. Some very, very useful questions. Any thoughts on what Zara is asking?
Zara, were you thinking about the social return on investment?
Yes, that was the one. And I was thinking that it was something I'd be interested in looking into and seeing if anybody.
It's an interesting approach. I haven't done it myself. I'm trying to get a research project off the ground that would enable me to do it. I've done some of the training, and it starts with a theory of change, and then you can do your research, which can be qualitative, and then it has a way. I don't really understand it myself yet, but it has a way of magically turning that qualitative research into a factor, which then corresponds to a government recognized scale, which is then you can then say, well, that qualitative experience had this cash value.
And when you're talking about the theory of change, is that a theory of change which is a previously established theory of change, or a theory of change that maybe has been devised through a practice-led research methodology?
I think, I'm not an expert, but I think the idea is that you start the project by getting the stakeholders together and saying, what is it that we're seeking to change here, to ask exactly those questions that we said, who is going to be impacted and how will we expect their lives be changed? What's the transformation? And I think that's, you know, I had these conversations with my students all the time. What's the point of this project you're doing? Because if you don't know what that is, how are you going to evaluate success? And that seems to be a thing, you know. And I understand that when if you're just doing creative work, you don't necessarily go into it with a sense of I'm going to change people's lives. You're kind of exploring something of interest. But certainly with the kind of projects that I'm increasingly involved with, I need to know, well, how we're going to impact people, because we're going after public funding to do that. So being able to start with that process and say, we have a theory of change, this is who we're going to impact, this is how we're going to impact them, in theory, gives you that ability to quantify it at some point in time in a way that people like government agencies can go, yes, that's that scale. It's you've got a 4.5. Well, that's very good. That's worth this amount of money.
It is worth, Roy, thank you very much. It is worth pointing out that, you know, it is often difficult to quantify impacts in terms of money, although obviously government agencies love that. It actually takes me nicely into the question number 2. How do and could we as a media practice community engage with policy-led transdisciplinary challenges beyond our own specific forms to encourage impact-led research? And Zara has touched a little bit on this, Roy has touched a little bit on this. So this is the issue which I think is more contentious about how we are responding to agendas set by policymakers and how we can bring our own creative practice to meet that agenda or agendas. And I don't know if anybody, you know, I've certainly had dealings with that in terms of the great, you know, the global challenges, for example, the United Nations global challenges, where I've had funding where we've had to justify and very much put in place these pathways to impact in terms of, you know, what do we hope to address in our project that also fits in with their agenda? So how do we square this up as creative practitioners? I mean, I don't know about you. I always think, even if you're an artist getting Arts Council funding and so on, these are policy-led decisions about who they fund and how they fund it. And you all know that the people who get the funding are the ones who answer those links best. And how do we feel about this ethically? How do we feel about this morally as artists? How do we, you know, how do we respond to that? How do we work with colleagues across other disciplines to address some of these grand challenges? And what do you feel about it?
Could I comment on that a little bit?
Yeah.
One of the things that's happened with Arts Council funding over the last year, and partly because everyone's been at home writing funding applications, the Arts Council's absolutely swamped. But partly because they've kind of really started to push the sort of diversity inclusion criteria, the bar for evidencing public engagement has just kind of gone up massively. And applications that I've been successful in getting out of the Arts Council in the past, where we've said we're going to do public engagement and we've sketched out how we've done that, and we've have delivered on that. But now they're saying, oh, you need to know exactly what you're going to do, how you're going to access people, who it is you're going to do. We want to see bullet points with data, and I've just had feedback on an application we're just about to put in from an Arts Council person, and they said, oh, you need much more detailed demographic data. You need to be,
oh my God,
you know, really going into the granular. And my view on this is like, okay, I can see that, but I'm spending all my time developing, you know, really detailed plans about public engagement for a project that may never happen. it's like, am I delivering a project, or am I kind of doing public engagement research and just basically copying information that's available on public websites? I mean, it's not, no, you know, if I say that there is deprivation in the city in this particular area, that's based on, you know, publicly available information. So what am I doing there exactly?
Welcome to the world of bidding, Roy. You know, what I personally do is that I keep my own creative practice completely out of the arena of public funding. Partly because as an artist, I don't want to be answering government-led agendas. Now, these are personal decisions. Then I do other types of projects where I do want to, like my Story Lab project, where I can see there are some impacts that I want to see, where I can take some of my findings from my personal research and try to apply them and explore them in a slightly different context that might fit those public agendas. But every one of us will be different. Yeah. But if we, as a community, want to access serious sums of money, we have to grapple with this issue.
Well, that's the thing. For a long time, that particular kind of practice, that sort of arts-led, immersive sort of community engagement, is something that I and the people I work with, we're sort of a collective of volunteers. We've just been doing it, no money. We're not interested in engaging with the public funders, but we've got to the stage where we want to kind of move what we're doing on a little bit. And in order to do that, we need that funding. And you know, to say I'm starting to wondering whether that was a good idea.
Oh, you're speaking to somebody who's got until the 15th of July to put in a huge bid, and it's just a nightmare. But anyway, any thoughts on this issue? Because I'm conscious of time. Any kind of final thoughts about this issue? Because I'm sure we can continue. You know, these are very important issues, I think, because as I started my conversation about we as a sector, a creative practice sector, really need to make sure that we are at the top table and that we are confident about what we're doing, and we're confident about the impacts we're having, and that they're relevant, and that this then opens up doors for us to engage with our transdisciplinary colleagues across disciplines to do some wonderful transdisciplinary work, potentially. But it must be on the basis of equal partnerships, not just, you know, scientists coming in and using us as a way of documenting their research. This is something that we've been working with a lot of UCLan, because there's a lot of collaboration going on, but often we find that the creative practitioner quickly becomes the junior partner in a relationship that really should be a partnership of equals. So really, I'm just raising this as a kind of thing, but I think to do that, we have to speak the right language, and we have to have the confidence, and we have to be able to point to the impacts that our work has on the wider society in order to make that case. We can't just expect it. So those are my any other final thoughts or observations that anybody would like to make? Ivan, sorry, I missed you, Ivan. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. And I don't intend to make the final word on that issue, but just to comment on a challenge that I often have when I respond to some call, whether it's for research or for art, is how far can I align with the call without changing the nature of my work and my first intention. And to me, it's often a challenge. And a lot of the time, I say probably no too early without actually diving into it. And some other times, I go for it, and then I realize that, okay, I can still do what I intended to do. Or sometimes I realize, no, it's not me, and I cannot do it. I cannot conform myself to something that is not what I initially intended, you know, so something like that. So it's often a challenge for me. Plus understanding the agenda, which in itself, it's a whole thing, because it's not always clear from the core what their agenda is. So
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue, I think, that we could spend an entire session on, just on its own, how we engage with these grand challenges of various kinds, and what relevance it has to our own creative practice, our own quite personally driven creative practice. How do these two kind of align? And I think for many of us, that's a challenge. But anyway, I want to thank you all for participating. It's been a great pleasure, and you know, some really useful reflections and thoughts. So I'll hand back to Roy.
So if I could get everyone to clap emoji and say thank you to Erik for hosting. Well, I mean, it's like, it doesn't feel like we've just spent an hour and a half talking. It feels like we could just carry on. It's clearly a complex and complex discussion, and there's lots that came out of it. I think, you know, you could just have a whole symposium just about language and how we kind of formulate that language. I was very interested that, Erik, you've kind of produced this glossary. I don't suppose you're willing to share that, or is it, do you have some?
I suppose I could. It's about 4 years old now, so.
But you know, that seemed like a really valuable thing to do, and to be able to say to people, well, okay, so you've got to be able to explain what you do to people who are going to just scratch their heads and not understand it. I think that I don't think that's unreasonable. The impact glossary could have impact. Yes, Jamie said so. So thank you everyone for taking part. We're going to take a quick break now. There is a new Zoom link which you should all have. If you don't, just email me and I'll send it out. That's in about 15 minutes time. And Ben and I are just going to do a very brief sort of wrap up of the symposium. And then we're going to hand over to the Media Practice Education Journal Board. They're going to talk about their editorial refresh and their current call for papers. And great, this has been a really exciting day. I have to say, I've learned huge amounts. I'm going to go and rewrite my funding application now. So I'll see you all in very shortly.
See you in a minute.
Well, that wasn't
that good stuff.
Oh, I better stop the recording before we start.